Yeah, we're just gonna one take it. Never done this before. Never made a video. A little bit nervous, but we're doing it. I don't have my notes. Misinformation. Um, why? Why information? Why misinform people? Why would you want to do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Get your point across. Makes your point sound better. Just like this claim. This claim here, claiming right now, the leading claim at hand. Call me crazy. Call me crazy. But have I been the only one seeing like posts like this go around social media recently? Like it's just normal now. That's what they really want you to feel. Like the sacrifices I'm making don't mean anything because China is all undoing it. And if that's true, why even try? Why even try to do things for the environment? Try to reduce and mitigate the effects of climate change. But that blame that's put on China, it ignores a lot of context. So even I sometimes have trouble like parsing through pieces of information online. And I try my best to stay informed on these types of issues. The environment, like, holds a special place in my heart. I really like the environment. I like to see it do good things. Right now it's struggling, a lot. And whenever I see things like that, because I'm usually not even on X for real. Not to be like one of those people, but like I'm one of those. So much information out there, so many thoughts. What do you do? What do you do? And so I guess that's the purpose of this video. I'm gonna go through and try and dive into why it's important to do your research. Do your research, man. Do your research. Okay, so the main culprit here, CO2. CO2, like methane, like nitrous oxide, water vapor. These things are greenhouse gases. They help. I'm drawing a blank right now. The greenhouse effect is caused by the trapping of heat in the Earth's atmosphere by these greenhouse gases, hence the name. You see, CO2 has been rapidly produced by humans ever since the Industrial Revolution. Mostly by the things like burning fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, coal especially. Coal has been used since the inception of the steam engine, in order to actually power things. And even still today, it accounts for about 35% of the world's energy. Going back to that claim, it's true. It's true. China emits about 30% of global emissions. Though the claim that China produces more than the entire developed world, even if you took into account all right, let's limit the definition developed. Let's take the U.S., the U.K., the EU. There's three ways to measure carbon emissions: total emissions per year, total emissions per capita per year, total emissions since the Industrial Revolution. CO2 itself, it stays in the atmosphere. It can stay in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. Set in a normal setting, CO2 would naturally be taken up by the Earth's carbon sinks. It would be taken up by the ocean, vegetation through photosynthesis, naturally. When CO2 is released naturally into the air, the Earth is able to balance it out. But when you see humans adding unnatural amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere, you see these systems become overwhelmed and unbalanced. And in many cases, you see things like deforestation really having disastrous effects on the amount of CO2 that can be consumed by these forests, rainforests, like taking the Amazon, for example. Even if we stopped all CO2 emissions, the world would still warm, So, like, in a sense, what we do now would only keep the warming to about how it is now. So, you look at per capita, the US, for every US citizen, they produce about 14 trillion tons CO2 into the atmosphere per person per capita. China only 8.3 trillion per person per capita. If we're trying to take that claim that China emits more than the entire developed world, it can't really work in every frame of analysis. A trend I notice within that data is that these developed nations like US, EU countries, UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, Russia, etc., they have built their wealth through the burning of fossil fuels, and China's essentially doing the same thing that they did during industrialization. It's just that China's just now starting to catch up with the amount of CO2 that other developed nations have been producing. Over the past couple of decades, China's economy has been growing at an exponential rate. And many economists, U.S. economists, European economists, see that as a threat to the global economic, political, geopolitical order or whatever. China and much of the global south and these periphery, semi-periphery countries, they had to industrialize much later, much later. The global north has already gone through this process. They've already gone through this process. And on top of that, they are able to take advantage of China's need to industrialize, need to develop by their sheer demand of manufacturing production from China and these other periphery countries in order to bolster their own economies, bolster their specifically consumer products, also within areas pertaining to even things like renewable energy, like EV parts, batteries, semiconductors. China produces a large amount of these goods that the US and the EU need in order to sustain their developed economies and consumer bases. Essentially, you can see this as a case of exporting pollution, the Kunitz curve, as a society's GDP per capita increases, the amount of pollution decreases, which, in the sense of CO2 emissions, seems to be slightly the case, but it doesn't factor into the exporting of pollution, or even other types of pollution which also harm the environment. It could be further explained by China also being a net exporter of CO2, essentially meaning China exports more CO2 related to their products than they import. So you have annual CO2 emissions, which China definitely takes the cake at about 30% of emissions globally as of 2023. Look at per capita per year emissions. The U.S., Australia, Canada, many other smaller countries, they far exceed China when it comes to per capita emissions. And then you look at cumulative CO2 emissions since industrialization. China is just now recently has been kind of going up in the charts, but the U.S., UK, EU nation, the EU, like the EU nations, they have been the main contributors to cumulative CO2 emissions, with the U.S. at about 25% CO2 emissions cumulatively since industrialization. I guess you say now, like, what should we take away from that information? addressing the claim if China's emissions cancel out our. Ooh, I think my roommate has a cold. Our sacrifices. Why should we even try? Or why care? You know, and I think that just ignores like a few like pretty big points. His emissions are linked directly and indirectly to other countries like the US, UK, EU. Per capita emissions show clear inequities in the way that the data is represented. Number three, historical emissions. Developed nations take a large responsibility in the amount of CO2 in the air. And remember, CO2 remains in the atmosphere for centuries. And because of how much CO2 humans are producing, it inherently makes the problem worse. You know, that matters. The blame China narrative, it just completely oversimplifies the whole issue of climate change, the whole framing of the issue, essentially.